Sinister Harry Potter crossover short story, Harry Potter and the Babylonian Deity. Chapter 8, Hide and Seek, Year 2001. The snake hissed as it circled the woman's body lying on the ground. It stopped near the tip of her head and started to extend its jaw. It used its fangs to secure her head, and then slowly it started to consume her. Its body widened as it swallowed the woman. Lord Voldemort watched in fascination. Peter Pettigrew made a disgusted sound and turned away. Wormtail always had a queasy stomach, but his natural affinity to rats made him despise their natural enemy, the snake. The woman that Nagini was devouring was a ministry witch named Bertha Jorkins. She had recognized Wormtail in Albania, and he had tricked her. After locating Lord Voldemort, Wormtail had used her to help resurrect the Dark Lord. Poor Bertha Jorkins. What could be said about her? She had been a pleasant but not very bright woman. She had been too trusting and naive, but she had long ears and had quite a bit of useful information. Lord Voldemort was able to track down a loyal Death Eater and place him at the school. Of course, the Dark Lord would have preferred to have used Harry Potter's blood to resurrect himself. What more fitting than the boy who had nearly destroyed him be the one to resurrect him? He certainly would have relished seeing Nagini devour him. Voldemort turned away and faced his father's tombstone. He scowled. Trips down memory lane were never pleasant, but his father had been useful to him at last, helping him to return to a body. But Harry Potter, he continued to haunt the Dark Lord. It seemed no one knew what had happened to the boy. Many believed Dumbledore had hidden him away, but it seemed that Dumbledore was genuinely baffled as the rest of them. The lack of closure was disturbing. He feared that his Death Eaters would doubt his power, as well as the rest of the wizarding world, if he didn't triumph over Harry Potter. Though he would never admit this to anyone else, he would doubt himself. It was humiliating to be done in by a drooling brat. It began to rain, though it was more of a mist. Voldemort closed his eyes and lifted his face up to the heavens. The sky was black and devoid of stars. "My lord," Wormtail spoke up, "shall we go inside? It is starting to rain." "What's wrong, Wormtail?" the Dark Lord replied. "Afraid you are going to melt?" Wormtail muttered and pulled his shabby coat tighter around him. Voldemort made a dismissive gesture. "Go, I'll follow in a minute." Wormtail didn't need to be told again. What Voldemort disliked the most about not knowing the fate of Harry Potter was that he would spend his new life always looking over his shoulder, wondering if the boy who lived would rise up to confront him. "I need to know," he thought. "There are many things that need to be done before I can reclaim the wizard world, but I need to know what happened to Harry Potter." Harry was in the middle of playing hide and seek with the other children when something distracted him. Suddenly he felt a tap on his shoulder and a voice say, "You're it!" Harry turned to see his newest brother, Milo. Behind him stood the other children. Though Milo was the newest addition to Mr. Boogie's family, it didn't take him long to become a leader. What was funny about Milo was that he didn't become a leader with his fist or by bullying. He was a quiet boy, rather aloof, but somehow he inspired the others to follow him. "What is it?" Milo frowned. I thought Harry trailed off, not knowing how to explain it. I thought I heard someone calling me." Milo frowned. "Well, it wasn't any of us." He glanced back at the other children, and they shook their heads in unison. "It couldn't have been Mr. Boogie either," Emma spoke up, coming forward. Harry frowned. "I know, it is strange. Sometimes I think people in the other world are calling to me. Do any of you ever experience that?" The other children frowned and shook their heads. I'd ignore it if I were you, Harry," Milo replied. "I don't think hearing voices is a good thing in this world either." Milo turned to the other children. "Okay, Harry is it. Let's hide." "Where is Harry?" a little girl named Catherine spoke up. "What do you mean? He's right." Milo turned, but Harry was gone. "Harry?" Harry had been concentrating on the voice, and suddenly it was like the ground had swallowed him. He seemed to fall endlessly, and then suddenly he stopped, and he found himself in an unfamiliar location. He was back in the mortal world. He knew that. The netherworld was quite different, so there was no way of confusing the two. How he wound up here, he didn't know. He was in a cemetery, in a place he had never been before. He looked at one of the nearest graves and read the name on the tombstone, Riddle. He heard a hiss, and he saw what looked like a snake, except its body was engorged and malformed. The snake peered at him with yellow eyes. Its forked tongue darted out of its mouth as it hissed. What amazed Harry is that he realized it was talking, and he could understand it. "A boy," the snake hissed. "There is a boy here. What is a boy doing here? Master, there is a boy here. Beware." Harry backed away and ran into something. He turned and gasped. You would think after getting accustomed to Mr. Boogie, appearance wouldn't startle him too much. However, he was still unnerved by the sight of the pale, noseless man with red eyes. "Nagini," the man hissed. "What is it? I see no boy that you speak of." "But master," the snake hissed, sounding as perplexed as a snake could, "he is there, right by you." Harry looked up at the puzzled man. He was staring down, but he didn't seem to see Harry. Harry ran and hid behind a tombstone. He peeked out at the man. He should get back to the netherworld. Mr. Boogie didn't like them wandering away. Yet, Harry felt a tugging towards this man. Something within him felt a connection. "Harry, what are you doing here?" Milo's voice startled him. Voldemort was puzzled. Nagini was seeing a boy he could not see, yet he had felt something run into him, and he had heard something run by. It wasn't uncommon for animals to see things that humans could, even wizards. Just like not all humans were magical, some spirits didn't have enough energy to be visible. The ghosts of Hogwarts, having been wizards and witches, had enough energy to make themselves visible to the naked eye. However, Voldemort was in a Muggle cemetery, and very likely if there was something here, it would be too weak to be visible. It wouldn't concern him, except Nagini had described the boy. She had mentioned that he had had a scar on his forehead, and the little information the Dark Lord had about Harry Potter, he knew that his attack on the boy had left him a souvenir and a scar that looked like a bolt of lightning on his forehead. But why would the boy be here? Suddenly he heard a child's giggle. It sounded like a little girl rather than a little boy. "Who's there?" he asked angrily, lighting his wand. He heard someone run behind him, and he turned but saw nothing. Then he heard a clanging in the opposite direction. He cautiously moved forward until he reached a mausoleum that belonged to a war hero. The clanking had sounded like someone running a stick across the bars, and there was a stick nearby. The light of Voldemort's wand caught something else strange. He reached out and touched the still wet, muddy handprint of a child. Once again he heard giggling and footsteps racing down the path. He turned to follow. He nearly lost his footing as he skidded in the slippery mud. He gasped, "Splotch!" That sound was in front of him. He frowned and held out his wand. Splotch! He looked down at the ground and noticed 2 shoe prints in the mud. As he continued to stare, a new shoe print formed in the mud, but he didn't see the person that was making it. The prints were tiny. It was obviously a child. Voldemort backed away. He fired a spell at the invisible intruder, but the spell just went through and hit a nearby tombstone. It exploded and sent rubble and dust everywhere. Then a voice near his ear whispered, "You can't catch me." The Dark Lord turned, but though he heard a giggle and retreating footsteps, he didn't see the person making the sounds. He stood there for a few minutes, hearing nothing but silence. When he turned around, though, he was greeted by an awful, inhuman face. He cried out and fell backwards, banging his head on the tombstone. Darkness clouded his vision, as dark as the creature's eyes that looked down on him. Bagul took a few steps forward and looked down at the unconscious man. The children were watching silently. Harry detached himself from the group and went up to his master. Bagul looked at him. Unlike the other children, Harry wasn't afraid of him. It had disturbed Bagul, but the child had been an obedient servant until now. "I didn't mean to run away," Harry explained timidly. I heard someone calling me, and then I thought about the voice, and I just sort of landed here." The other children looked terrified, fearing reprisal. Mr. Boogie had immediately sensed Harry's disappearance, and they all worried Mr. Boogie would punish all of them. Bagul looked down at the boy. He believed Harry. Unlike the other children, Harry had a connection to the man who was lying unconsciously on the ground. He contained a bit of that man's soul. Bagul put his hand on Harry's shoulder. Harry looked up at him, then smiled as his master suggested leaving their calling card. "My lord," he heard Wormtail's concerned voice. Someone shook his shoulder. "My lord!" Voldemort slowly opened his eyes. Wormtail's ugly face slowly came into focus. "Wormtail," he murmured, "what happened?" "I do not know, my lord." Wormtail's mouth quivered indecisively. "When you didn't come in, I went looking for you and found you on the ground. I thought you were dead. Perhaps you fainted?" The Dark Lord slowly got up. The back of his head, which had struck the tombstone, throbbed. He felt the smoothness of the back of his head, but there was no blood. He probably had a nasty bump. He allowed Wormtail to help him up. He was a bit unsteady on his feet. He remembered hearing the children he never saw and the horrible face he wished he hadn't seen. What had that been? "My lord," Wormtail explained, "what is that?" Voldemort looked down at his father's tombstone. There was a strange symbol drawn on the face of it that resembled the horrible face he had seen.